The message today is Amazing Grace Always. Grace is always amazing. Amen? God's grace is always amazing. And started back when last fall, right before Thanksgiving, I got sick. And, God's been stirring up in my heart, having been off the international or foreign mission field for these last several years. The Lord, Brother Kamen, he's been burning that missionary zeal that I once had when I was young. And the Lord's been doing something, and I trust the work that He's doing in my own heart will make me to be a better or stronger pastor. Ever feel like a failure? I know I do. You prepare something every week, and you get in the pulpit, and you feel like you did okay, and then you start thinking, well, I should have said that, or I shouldn't have said that, or failure is not final. Let's say that. We are fallen creatures. We're sinners saved by grace. Failure is not final. But do you ever feel like your failures have somehow disqualified you? I think we all go through that sometimes. Do you wonder if God's maybe rejected you? Well, we see this question here as Kamen was. These chapters 9, 10, and 11 are dealing with the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, and what he's saying here is we see this question. Israel's spiritual awkwardness here in verse 1. He says this, I say then, has God cast away his people? And his answer is certainly not. The word cast away literally is the word reject. In other words, has God rejected his own people? That to reject means to forcibly push somebody away or push somebody aside. You ever feel like you've been pushed aside? I'm sure all of us have at some point in life. Is that what God is doing with the nation of Israel? Paul is saying the answer is by no means. I believe the old King James says, if you got one, it says, God forbid. God forbid. By no means. Has God given up on his chosen people, the nation of Israel? No way. Because, as I said, their failures aren't final because God is faithful. Amen? God is faithful. God's the one. His plan will prevail. But let me just briefly summarize where we've been here these last couple of chapters. Chapter 9 of Romans, if you remember, he's talking about God's people, Israel, in the past. And he traces their Jewish unbelief, and he shows God's purposes even in their unbelief. Not everyone in the nation of Israel was saved, was a follower of the Lord. We see that in chapter 9. Then we get to chapter 10, and he's talking about right now, the present state of Israel. And even though he says they have a zeal for God, they are religious, very religious, they have a zeal for God, but he said it's not according to knowledge. Though the gospel has been preached, they turned away from the gospel. That verse keeps ringing back all day long. God says, all day long I've held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. And then we come here to chapter 11. And he's talking about Israel's future. You see, God is not finished with the nation of Israel because there's more promises to be fulfilled that we see in the Bible. And I think the application is if you feel like you failed, if you feel like you've been a failure, this passage is for you. This message today, this passage that we're dealing with is for you. I think the sermon in the sentence would be like this. God has always had a believing minority and a blinded majority. God has always had a believing minority and also a blinded majority. Notice what he says here in these first 5 verses. We don't see all that God is doing. You see, God is working. God is at work. God is at work in your life. God is at work in this church. God is at work in our world, in our country, and around the world, but we don't see all of it. Remember that God is always working, and He's weaving His purposes and His ways even when we cannot see it. And He gives us three examples here. The first example is Paul himself. Paul is an example of the fact that God hadn't given up on Israel, because notice what he says. I say then, has God cast away His people? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away His people whom He foreknew. In other words, Paul uses his own self. He said, God is not finished with Israel, because Paul, he said, I'm actually a Jew. I'm an Israelite. In other words, he can trace his lineage all the way back to Abraham, who was given the covenant that God had promised him. And you know, when Paul became a Christ follower, when he became a follower of Jesus Christ, he didn't stop being Jewish when he put his faith in Jesus. He became a completed Jew, as we would say. And the fact that Paul is a born-again believer shows that God keeps His promises. Somebody say that. God does keep His promise. Way back in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 22, we see this truth revealed. And so I would just say to you this morning, if you're worried about your future, hold on to the fact that God will not abandon you. He'll never leave you. He'll never forsake you. If you're one of His, He'll never leave you. He'll never forsake you. You may feel like it sometimes, but the truth is, He will not. He will not. If God can save someone like Paul, then God can save anybody. Remember, Paul, he was persecuting Christians. He was the biggest persecutor of Christ followers in his day. And if God can save the Apostle Paul, He can save anybody. His conversion is an illustration of the future conversion of the nation of Israel as we move toward the end of history. I read Elizabeth Elliot's book about her husband. You know, she was a missionary with her husband, Jim Elliot, in Ecuador. And Jim Elliot, along with 4 of his fellow missionaries, were murdered about 50, 60 years ago there in Ecuador. And I was reading that again, and she's written an updated version of it. And the updated version is even better, because it talks about the fact that the Auca Indian, who was the leader of the band that killed those missionaries, later on came to know Jesus Christ as his Savior. Okay, so here's a guy who his band of his tribe came, and when the missionaries landed, they murdered him. But later on, the gospel was shared with them, and this leader of the band of people that murdered Jim Elliot was saved. Folks, if God can save that Auca Indian who murdered missionaries, God can save anybody. So if you're praying for someone, and that person that you wrote down, remember a few weeks ago when I asked you to write, who's your one? Let me ask you, who's your one? If you've been praying for them, don't give up on them. You say, I've been praying for this person for 10 years. If God can save the Apostle Paul, if God can save that Auca, and He can save anybody, Brother John, do not give up on anyone. So Paul talks about the fact, God hadn't given up on His people, because I'm an Israelite. Notice the second example he gives us Elijah. Do you not know what the Scripture says about Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel, saying, Lord, they've killed your prophets, torn down your altars, and I'm the only one. I alone am left, and they seek my life. But Paul goes on to say, but what does the divine response say to him? What did God say to him? No, you're not. God said, I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed their knee to Baal. You see, Elijah thought he was the only one. God says, no, I've got 7,000 more. You remember that story, don't you? He had experienced this great victory of the prophets of Baal, but then he was afraid of that wicked lady. What was her name? Jezebel. Old Jezebel, the wife of King. And so he runs. You remember he runs hundreds of miles, and he ends up hiding in a cave, fearing for his life. And when he finally talks to God, when he finally has a conversation with God, he complains about how evil Israel is and how outnumbered he is. And he's saying, everyone's against me. I'm the only one that stood up for God in the whole country. That's what he thought. Do you ever feel that way? It's easy nowadays, even though we're in the Bible Belt. You ever suffer from the Elijah complex? I'm the only real believer in my school. I'm surrounded by a bunch of pagans at work. I'm the only one walking with God in my family. There's not any real true Christ followers in my whole neighborhood. I'm the only one concerned about truth, real truth. Here's one, I'm going to meddle a bit. I'm the only one that really knows how to really worship in the church. I'm the only one serious about missions and nobody else is. You know, while we might think that we're the only one on God's side, God always has more than we think. Somebody say that. God always has more than we think. You see, God had reserved a remnant of 7,000, a group of 7,000 believers. Elijah thought he was the only one. God said, no, you just don't see like I see. You see, God sees it all. You and I see just part of it, just limited what we can see. You see, and God says here, his remnant was his personal possession. God says, they're mine. You see, Elijah couldn't see it because why? He was, as we would say in Tennessee or Mississippi, he's belly aching, Brother Chuck. He was having a pity party. You ever have a pity party? That's what was happening to him. He was focused on himself, but God had a remnant of true believers that he couldn't see. You see, sometimes we mistakenly think that God is just at work in our country. Another book I've been reading about is what's called the Back to Jerusalem movement in China. Did you know that in China over the last 25 and 30 years, young Chinese believers in Jesus Christ have been sent by underground home churches back to the Middle East to share the gospel, to where the gospel came from. It's called Back to Jerusalem. It's an interesting story. It's going on right now. Some of them get saved and they leave their jobs. They really don't even have any support, but they say, God's called me back to where the gospel, and they go to Jerusalem. Go back to the Middle East as self-supporting missionaries. God is at work. We can't always see what he's doing. What did Jesus say after the risen Lord Jesus say in Acts 1:8? Remember when I preached through the book of Acts? That was a long time ago. What did he say? He said, you'll be witnesses to me. Where? In Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. Yes, God is working. We don't always see what he's working, that he's working. Well, he gives a third example. Himself. That shows God hadn't given up on it. He said, Paul said, I'm a Jew. Secondly, he talks about Elijah way back. And then now he's talking about believers right now. Notice what he says in verse 5. Even so then, at this present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. What is he saying here? God has a remnant of true believers in Jesus among Jewish people. I was telling you on my street, on my little cove there in Cordova where I live. Right across the street, there's Ben Yeoman. I call him, most people call him Barry. And Judy, Elegant is their last name. They're completed Jews. He was telling me his testimony not too long ago, how he came to Christ. Now, you go a little bit further down the street, and there's Victor, and he's still I don't really think he's practicing. He was born a Jew, but he hasn't trusted in Jesus. But you know, there are Jewish background believers. There's an organization called Jews for Jesus. There's another one called Friends of Israel, I believe. It's on the radio. Did you know that there is an increasing number of Jewish people today who are coming to faith in Jesus Christ as their Messiah? And these ministries that work in this area tell us that there are more Jewish believers than there ever has been. And I believe as we come closer to the return of Christ, we're going to really see that many, I believe there's going to be thousands, Brother Jim, of Jewish people who are going to come to faith in Jesus Christ as we come to the time when Jesus comes again. But there's three words here in this verse that really jump out. The first one is the word remnant. You see, there's never been a time when the whole nation of Israel followed God wholeheartedly. But there's always been a small group that did. I believe that Christ's followers will always be in the minority. If you know Jesus this morning, you are part of the remnant of the redeemed. You're part of God's remnant. You'll never be forsaken because he counts your faith as righteousness, and you are reserved for him. You belong to him. Just like they sang that song earlier when Mercy walked in. There's a remnant. God always has had a believing minority and a blinded majority. The second word that jumps out at me is the word chosen. That's literally that word elect. It's the same word that's used in the Gospels when it says Jesus chose his 12. It's always great for us to remember that in a real sense, we didn't choose God, God chose us. That's what Jesus said. I know there's a point in which we have to respond to the Lord, but in essence, God's the one that took the initiative. The other one is what we've been singing about all morning, that word, grace. We're going to get to that in a minute. Grace. Notice what it says. The election of grace. And if by grace, then it is no longer works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. Grace. In other words, it's not about keeping a bunch of rules. It's not about keeping the law. It's not even about, you know, the do's and don'ts. It's not even really about religion as such. God has given us his unmerited favor, his grace, irregardless of what we've done or whether we think that we deserve it. No, we don't see all that is doing, but we know that he's at work. You can't see all that God's doing, but you know he's at work because God is always at work. The second thing that we learn from our passage today is that grace is a gift and it's not a reward. And there's a difference. Grace is a gift. It is not a reward. That's what he's saying there. If by grace is no longer works, otherwise grace is no longer grace. Or it's of works is no longer grace. Otherwise the work is no longer... We see this, we've already seen it many times, haven't we, already in the book of Romans. It's a paradox, Brother Wayland. This is what we call a paradox. You see, if you work at trying to please God, I want to tell you it won't work. The only way to have a relationship with God is not by working for it, but to accept it as a gift of God's grace. For by grace have you saved through faith. It is not of yourselves. It's a gift of God. You see, works don't work. And if you're trying to mix grace and works, did you know they cancel out each other? You see, human effort and God's grace are mutually exclusive when it comes to salvation. We're all saved by the grace of God. We don't deserve it. Mercy walked in. It did. We're guilty. Galatians 2, verse 21, Paul summarizes that. He said, I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. If we could be saved by keeping the law, why did Jesus come and die on the cross? That's what he's saying there. It's by God's grace. Well, I saw a bumper sticker. You've probably all seen it. It says, "Be patient with me. God is not finished with me yet." Well, someone came out with a new one recently. It says, "I'm trying to be patient with you, but God's taking an awful long time, isn't he?" Isn't it hard to be patient with people who never seem to change? Here's the real question. Have you settled into a comfortable, casual Christian faith, or are you trying so hard that you just get tired of trying? Let me tell you, if you're just trying hard, you're going to get tired, and you're probably, if you're not going to get tired, you're going to get proud. It doesn't work that way. You need to get real. You're saved by grace, and you live by grace every day. Get real and trust Christ as never before is what I'm telling you today. Most are trying harder to measure up when we really need to have a greater understanding of what it means to live by grace. Live by the grace of God. And I've seen so many folks, while we may know that we've been saved by grace, we forget that we also are living by grace every day, every moment. Our faith is not about a bunch of following rules and regulations. It's about staying close to Jesus. That's what it's about. Are you staying close to Jesus? Because if you're staying close to Jesus, he'll give you what you need to live every day. It's not a matter of trying harder, as so many fall into that trap. We are to live out our faith in Jesus Christ the same way that we received it. How did we receive it? By grace. By grace. By his grace. Of course, I think we have some warning signs to help us. There's those that, have the, Brother Chuck, we call it the willpower approach, We want to respond to our temptations by telling ourselves, I shouldn't do that, or I shouldn't do this. Or we want to do self-talk that maybe will keep us away from that sinful desire. Folks, it don't work. You can try that. A lot of people do. Let me tell you, I've tried it. It don't work. It don't work. Then there's the other folks who are duty-based. They try to motivate themselves to do something because this is what I should do. I've done that too. It might work for a little while. It doesn't work very long. And then there's what I want to call anger-based approach. You ever done that one where you just beat yourself up over your sin because you think your anger is going to help you do better in the future? You see, all of these things that I've mentioned so far are what we call rule-oriented. They assume that we can stay on the right track if we keep up with all the shoulds and the shouldn't in our minds, and if we're strong enough as an individual. But if we approach our Christian life in that way, we're not relying on our relationship to Jesus Christ. It's your relationship to Jesus. Are you walking with Jesus? Are you walking close to Jesus? Because if you walk close to him, he'll never fail you. He'll give you what you need to face whatever. You see, the key is to connect with Jesus Christ by maintaining a close walk with him. You say, well, Pastor, how you do? Pretty simple. Prayer. Prayer. I read recently, it's been a challenge to me. Some of these Barna surveys, Brother Kamen will get you upset and frustrated, but this one did. It was a survey of how much time Christians spend in prayer every day. But the one that really got me was, Brother Bill, how much time pastors every day spend in prayer. Oh, it was embarrassing, folks. You want to be close to Jesus? Spend time in prayer with him every day. Prayer. Of course, this is the only spiritual food we got right here is Word. Spending time in the Word. I tell you, you go a few days without reading the Word of God. If I go a few days without reading the Word of God, and every once in a while that happens, I tell you, folks, I'm in trouble. I get skinny spiritually. You get skinny spiritually, Brother Tommy, you're in trouble as a Christian. This prayer and the Word of God. Get in the Word of God and corporately worship. That's another way. Be in community with other believers. Spend time with other Christians. That's what we do at church. You know, it's ultimately not a matter of trying harder. It don't work, folks. If you just try harder. No. It's a matter of trusting more and praying more and spending time in the Word and with God's people. That's the only way you can grow. That's the only way you can be strong. It's not by doing a bunch of do's and don'ts and all that stuff. That's not what this is about. If that's been your view of Christianity, you've fallen into a trap of the enemy, because it don't work like that. You see, we can't make ourselves holy, but we can humble ourselves, right? James puts it this way, James chapter 4, verse 6. As you therefore, he gives more grace, therefore he says, God what? Resists the proud. But what does he do to the humble? He gives grace. You want more of God's grace? Humble yourself. Humble yourself. Humble yourself. Well, finally, we come to the last few verses here, verses 7 through 10, and we find out that there's consequences to rejecting Jesus Christ. This is what he's saying here. These last several verses here, last 3 verses here are kind of tough. But that word hardened, well, let me read it again. What then? Israel has not obtained what it seeks, but the elect have obtained it, and the rest were blinded. Just as written, God has given them a spirit of stupor, eyes that they do not see, ears that they do not hear to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a recompense to them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they do not see, and bow down their backs always. What he's talking about is hardening, folks. What does it mean to be hardened? It means to be made unresponsive. Hard like a rock or a stone, callous, insensitive. This is what he says. You want the explanation? Israel, as a whole, as a nation, has become insensitive to the Holy Spirit. That's the explanation. He's quoting Isaiah here, especially verse 8, and then from David in verse 9. But notice they were only hardened because they rejected instead of receiving the Messiah. He says they're in a state of spiritual slumber. They couldn't any longer see the truth, and they didn't want to hear the truth either. Boy, that describes our culture today, doesn't it? He's quoting Isaiah 29:10. The Lord has poured out to you the spirit of deep sleep. Close your eyes, namely the prophets, and he's covered your heads, namely the seers, the prophets. In other words, God said God silenced his prophets because Israel refused to listen to him. That may be what's happening to our country. I don't know. I think we all know people like that, don't we? They just seem to be in a spiritual sleep, uninterested, unable to hear the message. Why? Because they rejected Christ repeatedly. You see, if someone rejects Christ repeatedly, their heart gets hard. Paul puts it this way in 2 Corinthians 4:4. This is what he says. He's talking about people who are lost, people who are away from God. He says, whose minds the God, little g, notice, of this age has blinded, who do not believe, lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God, would shine upon them. And he's basically saying the same thing that verse 9 says here, quoting the Old Testament. You know, it talks about a table. He says that, you know, the table in that day represented a God's protection, God's provision. It was a place, the table and way back in that day was a place of safety. It was a place of feasting. But instead, he says, your table is now going to become a place of fear, is going to become a place of punishment. You see, their blessings were turned into burdens. God intended to bless them. They were his people, but they turned into burdens because they rejected the Lord. God always protects and provides for his people. Amen? If you're one of his, he's going to provide. He's going to protect you. But if those blessings are not received by faith and trust in the Lord, then they'll become a stumbling block to you. I believe that's what's happened today, even among many believers. You see, God's blessings always demand a response one way or the other. You either you trust them, you take them in, or you say, no, not for me. Either you accept them with gratitude or reject what God has done for you. In other words, you receive the truth of God or you resist it. And what he's saying here, what God is saying this morning, is because Israel resisted God and they took his blessings for granted, God says now they're hardened. Their hearts are hard. It's like Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Here's what he says. But even to this day, when Moses, he's talking about the first 5 books of the Old Testament, when Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart. Nevertheless, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Amen. When they turn to the Lord. So remember this morning as we close out our time of worship, we don't see all that God's doing. We just don't see it because we're limited. God's working, folks. We may not see it, but he's working. He's always working. Grace, Brother Chuck, is a gift. It is not a reward for what you've done. Your salvation is not a reward. It's a gift. It is a gift. And there's real consequences to rejecting the Lord Jesus Christ. Let me ask you this morning, are your failures holding you back? Or maybe it's your fears. Sometimes it's failures and sometimes it's fears, Lisa. Your fears holding you back. You see, God's grace is always amazing, isn't it? Let's say that. God's grace is always amazing. It is. And so you say, well, what do we need to do? The hardest thing that we will ever do is what Paul said in the 12th chapter that we're about to see. What does he say? This is getting ahead here. What's your spiritual worship? Be a living sacrifice. A living sacrifice. You know what somebody said though, don't you? The problem with a living sacrifice, Lisa, is it can crawl off the altar. A dead sacrifice, but a living sacrifice can get off the altar. Have you crawled off the altar? I would urge you today, if it will help you to come forward this morning and ask for prayer or just to kneel here in the altar or whatever. Let me just say a blunt message this morning. It's not a matter of trying harder, folks. That don't work. It's a matter of trusting more. Trusting in the Lord who is at work in your life. Let's stand. We're going to sing a hymn of response this morning as we close out. Jesus, I come. We haven't sung that in a long time, but that's what it is. Jesus, I come.